My father had been dead for 11 days when my brother slid a manila envelope across the dinner table and told me to sign it. We were in my mother's dining room in Dayton, Ohio, surrounded by relatives I hadn't seen since the last Christmas before everything fell apart, plates of food nobody really wanted, and the particular kind of silence that settles into a house after someone has been buried out of it. My aunt's roast was still warm. The sympathy flowers on the sideboard were starting to droop. Someone had propped up a photograph of my father at the center of the table. Him at the lake in 1998, squinting into the sun, looking younger than I'd ever actually known him to be. My brother Carson set the envelope in front of me and said, "Just sign where the tabs are, it's estate stuff." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my mother Lorraine at the far end of the table, watching me with the expression I had known my entire life. The one that meant do what he needs. Don't make this into something. I looked at my brother's face. He was 36 years old. He had the easy, expectant look of a man who had spent 3.5 decades getting exactly what he wanted and had no particular reason to believe tonight would be any different. I said, "Let me read it first." His jaw tightened. "It's a formality, Naomi." I opened the envelope anyway. It was not estate paperwork. It was a personal guarantee agreement for a $75,000 SBA business loan, with my name typed into the guarantor line. If Carson's food truck expansion defaulted, I would be personally liable. My credit score, my savings account, my name attached to someone else's gamble. I set it down. I folded my hands on top of it. "No," I said. My mother pushed her chair back so fast it scraped across the hardwood floor, stood up in front of every aunt and cousin and family friend packed into that dining room, pointed at me, and said, "Your father is barely cold in the ground, and you cannot do one single thing for this family. What is wrong with you?" The room went quiet. An uncle I barely knew looked down at his plate. Someone's young child, who had been running laps through the living room doorway, stopped moving. I want to tell you I had something perfect ready to say. I didn't. I picked up my purse, pushed in my chair, and walked out the front door. I sat in the rental car in the driveway for a long time, watching the light from the dining room window, hearing the muffled sound of conversation starting back up inside. The kind of conversation where everyone agrees that I overreacted, that Carson was just trying to help, that I had always been difficult. I knew that script. I had been hearing it my whole life. But before I tell you what happened in the weeks after that night, and a lot happened, none of it what Carson was expecting. Subscribe if you're new, hit like, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Chicago with a plant named Bruno that I have kept alive for 4 years, which I consider one of my genuine personal achievements. I work as a senior financial analyst at an accounting firm downtown. I have a small circle of friends, a gym habit I maintain inconsistently, and a brother named Carson and a mother named Lorraine with whom I have a history that took me the better part of a decade to fully understand. My father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October. He was 61. He was alone in the kitchen. He had been meaning to see a doctor about his blood pressure for 2 years and kept putting it off. That is the detail I keep coming back to. Not that he died, but that he had been planning to take care of himself and just never quite got around to it. I flew home the same night I got the call. Carson drove up from Columbus, where he had been living in an apartment above a bar he claimed to frequent for networking purposes. For the first 48 hours, we were just people who had lost someone, and nothing else mattered or existed. Then the paperwork started. My father had a will. He had called me on a Sunday 2 years earlier while I was doing laundry and said, "Naomi, I want you to have a copy of this, just in case." He mailed it to me in a brown envelope. I filed it in the folder I keep under my bed with my passport and my insurance documents, and I didn't think much about it afterward. The will was simple. The house, worth roughly $180,000, and whatever remained in his savings, which turned out to be about $40,000, were to be split equally between Carson and me. What I did not know was that while I was in Chicago processing grief and scheduling bereavement leave from work, Carson was in Dayton doing something else entirely. Let me back up, because the envelope on that table didn't come from nowhere. It came from 32 years of a very specific dynamic. Growing up, Carson and I were treated like two completely different experiments. He was the charming one, the one whose bad grades were just a phase, whose job losses were bad luck, whose car accidents were unfortunate coincidences that happened to other people around him. I was the one who made the dean's list and received a nod. I was the one who got a part-time job at 15 and was expected to pitch in for groceries. When Carson totaled his car at 17, my mother sat me down and explained that family helps each other and that I should contribute to the insurance deductible. I was 15 years old. I gave them $200 from my babysitting savings. I went to bed that night telling myself it was the right thing to do. Carson got a better car 6 months later. College was more of the same, just with larger numbers. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs, waitressing on weekends, tutoring on weekday evenings, to pay for my books and rent. I never asked my parents for anything. Carson went to a private school my parents helped fund, dropped out after a year and a half, and spent the next decade cycling through ideas. Landscaping, an Etsy shop, a dropshipping operation that I still don't fully understand. And finally, 3 years ago, the food truck, which he described with the unshakable conviction of someone who has never actually run a business and therefore has no framework for how wrong they might be. Every time Carson needed money, the ask eventually found its way to me, sometimes directly, more often through my mother, who had a talent for framing other people's disasters as natural events that you'd have to be monstrous not to respond to. I gave him $3,000 for equipment once. I gave my mother $1,500 for a water heater that turned out to be partially for his rent. When he asked me to co-sign a commercial kitchen lease, I finally said no, and my mother didn't speak to me for the better part of a week. The word they always used was selfish. If I kept my own money, I was selfish. If I asked where it was going, I was selfish. If I said I needed time to think about it, I was selfish. I had been hearing that word used as a weapon for so long that I had almost stopped feeling it land. Almost. In the year before my father died, I had quietly started building some distance. I called home less. I visited for 3 days at Thanksgiving instead of a full week. I stopped sending money when the requests came through, and I did it without a big conversation, without an ultimatum, without any of the dramatic scenes I had rehearsed in my head and never delivered. I just slowly redirected my life. My therapist called it healthy differentiation, which is clinical language for learning to treat yourself like someone worth protecting. And then my father died, and I flew home, and within 11 days there was an envelope on the table. 2 days after the memorial dinner, I went to the Montgomery County Probate Court, not because I suspected anything specific. I just wanted to understand the process, know the timeline, know what the estate required. I was a financial analyst. Reading documents was what I did for a living. I pulled up the estate file for my father's name at the public records terminal. There was already a petition in the system. Carson had filed a petition for summary administration 3 days after my father died. While I was still in Chicago, still figuring out how to book a flight home, the petition stated that my father had died without a valid written will, that the estate was small enough to qualify for the simplified process, and that Carson, as the surviving adult child and primary caregiver, should be appointed sole personal representative and primary beneficiary. Primary caregiver. Carson had visited twice in the past year that I knew of. I had flown home 4 times, including twice specifically to take my father to medical appointments he kept rescheduling. I stood at that terminal and read the petition twice, slowly. Then I walked to my car in the parking lot, drove to a McDonald's 3 blocks away, and sat in the drive-through lane for a long time without pulling forward. It was 11 in the morning on a Thursday. People were ordering coffee and hash browns. The world was operating normally, completely indifferent to the fact that my brother had filed a legal document containing statements he knew were false. I had the original will in Chicago. I had the brown envelope it had arrived in, with the postmark and my father's return address. I had a sticky note in his handwriting tucked inside that said, "Keep this somewhere safe, Naomi." I had everything I needed. Before I left the parking lot, I opened my credit monitoring app. I used one of those services where you get an alert anytime there's a new inquiry on your report. There was one I didn't recognize. A $30,000 business line of credit applied for using my father's house address and an old EIN from a sole proprietor license he'd briefly held years ago for a side project. My name appeared on the application as a guarantor. I had not signed anything. I had not agreed to anything. I had not even been asked. I drove back to the motel. I packed my bag. I lay on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling and thought about a word that had followed me around for my entire life. Selfish. The 15-year-old version of me, who gave away her babysitting money because she wanted her mother to look at her with something other than impatience, that girl would have called what I was about to do selfish. She had been trained to believe that protecting herself was the same as failing everyone around her. I was not that girl anymore. When I got back to Chicago, I spent 2 days scanning and organizing everything. The will, the postmarked envelope, my credit report with the unauthorized inquiry flagged, screenshots of the probate court filing. I sent the full package to an estate attorney named Ms. Reyes, who had been recommended to me by a colleague. She reviewed everything that same day and called me back. "We filed a counterpetition," she said. "We authenticate the will and challenge the false statements in his petition. We also send a notice to the bank flagging the credit application as unauthorized." "How long will this take?" I asked. "A few months," she said, "but your position is solid. The will is legitimate, the postmark is verifiable, and the original petition contains statements that are provably incorrect." "Okay," I said. "Do not contact your brother or mother during this process," she said. "Let the legal system do the work." That was the hardest instruction to follow, not because I wanted to call them and explain myself. I had gotten past that years ago, but because doing nothing is its own kind of effort. Going to work, making coffee in the morning, going to the gym on Thursdays and staring at the wall during the cool-down, answering emails, living an ordinary life while something significant was quietly moving through a legal process I had set in motion and could not rush. I told Priscilla, my closest friend from college. She said, "Oh my God," 6 times in a row and then said, "What can I do?" I told her nothing, just knowing was enough. She said okay and then said, "Oh my God," one more time for good measure. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday, I woke up at 6 in the morning to 22 missed calls. Carson, a few from my mother Carson again. The last one had come in at 3:18 a.m. There was a text message. "What did you do?" "They froze the account. My loan application was denied. Call me." I made coffee. I showered. I put on clothes that made me feel like myself, a blazer, good shoes. Then I texted back, "I'll meet you at the Perkins on Wilmington Pike at 9. Come alone." He did not come alone. My mother was with him. They were already there when I walked in a corner booth away from the windows. My mother's hair was pulled back in a way that wasn't quite intentional. Carson was wearing a hoodie, which I noticed because Carson had always been careful about appearance. He believed in the power of first impressions in the particular way that people do when everything else about them is unreliable. The hoodie told me things had gotten bad enough that he'd stopped managing the surface. I sat down across from them. I did not hug anyone. I set my folder on the table. "Thank you for coming," my mother said. Her voice was careful, managed, the tone she used when she was trying to control the temperature of a room. "We need to sort this out." "Okay," I said. Carson explained that the estate account was frozen pending the probate dispute, that his loan application had been flagged, that he was going to lose a deposit on a second food truck location he'd been trying to secure. He said there had been confusion with the paperwork. He said the petition was filed in good faith. He said he hadn't realized there was an existing will. "You knew Dad sent me a copy," I said. "I wasn't sure that version was the most recent one," he said. "You filed a legal document stating he died without a will," I said. "That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a false statement in a court filing." He looked at the table. "Your brother made mistakes," my mother said. "He was grieving. He panicked. He made bad decisions in a terrible moment. But this can be handled inside the family, Naomi. You call the bank, tell them the credit application was authorized, withdraw the counterpetition, and we all move forward. We take care of it ourselves." "You want me to commit fraud," I said. "I want you to save your brother." Her voice broke on the last word, and I don't think it was performance. I think she genuinely believed that was the thing that would reach me, that it would still work the way it always had, the way it had been working since I was 15 years old and handing over my babysitting money. That is what family does. I looked at her for a long moment, 32 years of sitting across tables from this woman, waiting to be looked at the way she was looking at me right now, with that fierce, unconditional, "We will solve this no matter what" energy. It had always been aimed at someone else. "I'm not going to do that," I said. The will is valid. The estate will be divided as my father intended. The fraud report has already been filed with the bank and with the county. You already filed, Carson said. His voice had gone flat. 3 weeks ago, I said. The silence in that corner booth was complete. I looked at my brother. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel righteous. I felt something closer to exhausted in a clean way. The tiredness that comes after something difficult is finally finished, not the tiredness of still being inside it. I don't think you're a bad person, I said. I think you spent your whole life being told that needing things made you special and that someone else would always cover the gap. I don't think you ever fully thought about what that cost me. I'm not sure you thought about it this time either. I picked up my folder and stood. I'm sorry about Dad. I genuinely mean that. Take care of yourself, Carson. I walked out. The drive back to the highway was about 20 minutes. I turned the radio on and then off again. I ate a granola bar from my bag. By the time I reached the interstate, I could breathe all the way down. The probate court issued its ruling 4 months later. The will was authenticated. The false statements in Carson's petition were noted in the record. The estate was divided equally as my father had intended. Carson's share went almost immediately toward attorney's fees and the deposit he'd already lost on the second location. My mother spent down a significant portion of her own savings, trying to help him through the legal fallout. None of it was enough to change the outcome. My share came to just over $90,000. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans in a single transfer. I had been making payments on them for 9 years. When the confirmation email came through, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time without doing anything. Then I booked a flight to Lisbon. I spent a week there in February, walking around the old neighborhoods, eating at small restaurants, sitting on terraces in the thin winter sun. On the last afternoon, I called Priscilla from a rooftop overlooking the river and said, I think I'm actually okay. She said, I know. You've been okay for a while. You just couldn't see it from the inside. About 18 months after the Perkins, on a Sunday morning in March, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Joel was in the kitchen. The window was cracked open for the first time since November. Something made me answer. Hey, Carson said, it's me. I know, I said. He told me things weren't going well. The second location had never happened. The first truck was barely breaking even. He was behind on rent. He said he wasn't calling to ask for money. He said he knew better than that now. He said she wanted to say he was sorry. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the easy confidence that had always been his default mode. I forgive you, I said. Not because what you did was okay, it wasn't, but because carrying it around isn't doing me any good. He was quiet for a second. There's a nonprofit in Columbus called Compass Credit, I said. They do free financial counseling for people working through debt. I'd start there. They can help you make a real plan. Okay, he said. Take care of yourself, I said. I hung up. I set the phone on the cushion beside me and sat with the quiet for a moment. Then Joel called from the kitchen that breakfast was ready, and I got up. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to stop being the floor that other people stand on, especially when those people are your family, and especially when you were taught, from the time you were very young, that holding them up was your most important purpose. For a long time, I believed that stepping back was the same as giving up. I believed if I just tried harder, explained more clearly, gave more generously, eventually the dynamic would shift and I would feel like someone who was loved, rather than someone who was useful. I know now that some structures are not fixable. They were built wrong from the start, and no amount of effort from the person bearing the weight is going to correct the original design flaw. The things that fell in my family fell because they were already falling. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped throwing myself under what was coming down. The apartment is mine. The career is mine. The Sunday mornings with the window cracked open, and Joel's eggs and Bruno sitting on the windowsill in the morning light, mine. All of it, every piece of it. I built it alone, one careful year at a time, without anyone's permission and without anyone's help. And there is no version of selfish in the world that I would trade it for.